The time is at hand.
The elusive dog-like creature attacks livestock, bleeding them dry of blood.
8 to 10 feet tall, shadowy aliens.
But I am telling you right now,
we need a great reset.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen.
From 659 feet in the Appalachian Mountains, you're in dark places. I'm your Huckleberry, Junebug Fugit. I've been working out in the garden. I've got some corn and lettuce, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers. I just planted some kale, and I'm going to plant some pumpkins. But it suddenly dawned on me, we need a new episode. First things first, here's some news.
This is Mr. Haunted, your In Dark Places news correspondent, with some breaking news. So this story is out of Tullahoma, Tennessee. A local woman is the talk of the town after an outrageous claim that she recently made. Sierra Munson of Tullahoma says that she was impregnated by Bigfoot while on a camping trip a few months ago. It's the only logical explanation, says Munson, a longtime employee at the Dairy Queen in Coffee County. My husband is sterile, so we thought we couldn't have kids. Now I'm pregnant, and the only way this could happen is if Sasquatch was the daddy. Sierra's husband is fully supporting his wife, even though her story sounds a bit far-fetched. She was on a camping trip with her girlfriends a while back, says Harold Munson, 53 of Tullahoma. She said that Bigfoot snuck into her tent and had his way with her. I believe my wife. We've been married for a long time and she never lied to me. Experts in the scientific community have been quick to voice their skepticism. Dr. Albert Furman, a renowned geneticist at the prestigious Motlow Community College, remarked, from a biological standpoint, the likelihood of interspecies breeding is virtually non-existent. While Bigfoot sightings remain an intriguing mystery, we must rely on factual evidence, not personal anecdotes. Meanwhile, Harold Munson says that he looks forward to confronting Bigfoot one day soon to give him a piece of his mind. I got some strong words for that Sasquatch, warns Harold, and he won't like hearing what I have to say, that's for sure. Well, stay tuned. This is a developing story. Now back to In Dark Places.
Jimmy Haunted. Thank you, sir. Kind of curious what that kid's going to look like when it's born. Keep us updated. As of this recording, on June 4th, I still have not received my book, Mr. Haunted Origins, now available from Amazon. Link in the description. Amazon isn't quite as fast as they used to be. And now, Art Bell gets annoyed.
It's possible for human beings to remember skills and abilities from past lives and use them in their current life, pretty much like a download.
So
by the time I got back to Chicago, I really had to know, and I started regressing volunteers or asking people to get regressed. But the first time I remember being really shocked involved a regression with a young guy, probably in his middle 20s.
All right, hold that story. Hold on to that story. Hold it. Stop.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Apparently, you're having a hard time hearing me when I'm trying to make it a conversation. That could be a function. It could be a function of Skype. I'm not sure.
Go ahead.
This week on the show, we have strange creatures. Just after 5 a.m. on July 1st, 1965, Maurice Massey, a 41-year-old lavender grower, set to work in his fields situated on the Valençon Plateau in the Basses Alps of southeastern France. At about 5:45 a.m., he stopped to have a cigarette, parking his tractor by a hillside at the end of a small vineyard that lay along the northern side of the field. Suddenly he heard a shrill whistling noise and glanced around the hillock, fully expecting to see a helicopter. Instead, he saw a dull-colored object the size of a Renault Dolphin car, shaped like a rugby football, with a cupola on top. It was standing on 6 metallic legs, and there was also a central support, which appeared to be stuck in the ground. Close to the machine, Massey saw 2 boys, about 8 years old, bending over a lavender plant. Massey crossed the vineyard and approached the boys, believing them to be the vandals who had picked young shoots from a number of his lavender plants on several occasions during the preceding month. And then, to his surprise, he saw that he was not approaching boys at all, but 2 dwarf-like creatures with large, bald heads. He was about 15 feet from the beings when one of them turned and pointed a pencil-like instrument at him. Immediately, he was stopped in his tracks, unable to move any part of his body. According to Massey's description, the creatures were less than 4 feet tall and were wearing close-fitting gray-green overalls. They had huge pumpkin-shaped heads, but no hair, only smooth white skin. Their cheeks were wide and fleshy, narrowing to very pointed chins. The eyes were very large and slanting. The witness did not mention their noses, but he did describe their mouths, which were like thin slits and open to form lipless holes. It is rare in close encounters for humanoids to be reported as having their heads uncovered outside of the craft, as in this case. The creatures appeared to communicate with each other, but not with their mouths, for inarticulate sounds seemed to come from their mid-body regions. The hapless lavender grower thought they were mocking him, although he admitted that their glances were not hostile. Indeed, he never had the impression he was face to face with monsters. Massey has never disclosed what took place during the rest of the time he was immobilized 15 feet from the beings. After a few minutes, the creatures returned to their machine, moving in a remarkable manner, falling and rising in space like bubbles in a bottle without apparent support, sliding along bands of light to enter the object through a sliding door. The witness said he could see them looking at him from inside the craft, and suddenly there was a thump from the central support, which retracted. The 6 legs began to whirl, and the machine floated away at an angle of 45 degrees, making a shrill whistling sound. At 65 feet, it just disappeared, although traces of its passage in the direction of Manosque were found on lavender plants for more than 100 yards. These plants were withered, and then recovered and grew taller and finer than those nearby. The farmer grew alarmed as the invisible bonds that held him failed to relax their grip. But after 15 minutes, he slowly regained the use of his limbs. He could see marks left by some of the legs of the craft and almost liquid mud around the hole where the central support had entered the ground. There had been no rain in the area for several weeks. Here's a story from The 8th Tower by John Keel. My dog took off right up the ridge and up on top of the hill, Edgar Harrison said, recalling how he and a group of reporters pursued a tall, hairy humanoid. They took off after the thing when they heard it. Boy, you should have had a recording of those men when they hit that smell. I was with them, and it stank so bad you would have thought you were walking in horse manure. It was that strong. My dog went 300 feet up there, and then he came back with his tail between his legs. He laid right down in the back of the house and just got sick as can be. His eyes got bloodshot, and he lay there for over an hour, throwing up. I can't get him to go near the hill anymore. Harrison was the central figure in the famous Momo episode of 1972. Momo was first seen on July 11th, 1972, by the 3 Harrison children. "It was right there by a tree," said Doris Harrison, 15. 6 or 7 feet tall, black and hairy. It stood like a man, but it didn't look like one. I started crying and ran to call Mom on the telephone. The first sighting was around 3:30 in the afternoon, a rather exceptional fact, since most of our bilious boogeymen are nocturnal critters. Terry Harrison, 8, said the animal's face was completely covered with hair. It seemed to have no neck and appeared to be carrying a dead dog, flecked with blood under one arm. In the days that followed, some odd white and green fireballs were seen in the skies around the town of Louisiana, Missouri. The night air was rent with horrible screams, described variously as the sound of a woman screaming, a baby crying, and an animal in pain. Some huge footprints and bits of black hair were found in the woods on Marzoff Hill near the Harrison property. Police Chief Shelby Ward organized a 20-man posse, and they secured the area. Although the monster remained hidden, the screams and terrible smell returned again and again. These episodes stirred up considerable publicity. A team of UFO investigators from Oklahoma City visited the site and soberly announced that a flying saucer had obviously dumped the monster there. It was, they said, just another friendly visitor from outer space. Eventually, Edgar Harrison moved his family out of their little house and tried to sell it, but there were no takers. No one wants to live with a monster for a next-door neighbor. In 1974, Flying Saucer Review received a report from the Charles Fort Group of Valladolid in Spain, who had investigated a UFO sighting that had been made some years earlier. The witness was a 22-year-old woman, a domestic employee in the house of a farmer at Puente de Herrera, close to the river Duero, south of Valladolid. The young woman's name was withheld at her request, so let's respect her request. And she had no primary education, and was illiterate. We shall refer to her simply as the Senorita. On the night of August 15th, 1970, the Senorita had been watching television when she heard a piercing whistling noise. At the same time, the television picture was suddenly blotted out by a mass of lines. Playing with the controls had no effect, so she switched off the set and went to the front door of the house. The Senorita was astonished to see a weird object with various lights standing on the drive, and nearby she saw a very strange-looking man who seemed to be surveying a crop of alfalfa in an adjacent field. Very scared, the young woman went back inside the house and shut the door. Then the whistling sound began again, but when she looked out the window of her room, both the machine and the man had gone. The Senorita had only told her boyfriend of her experience at the time. Members of her family became aware of it only in March of 1972, when her brother-in-law had made some observations about UFOs. She told them about what she had seen. It was her brother-in-law who passed the information on to the Charles Fort Group. During the investigation that followed, Jay Macias and his fellow researchers learned that the period of time between the onset of the whistling noise and the witness first looking out the window was about 5 minutes. The whistling noise persisted while she was peering through the door, but seemed a little less intense. She had switched off the porch lights, as she usually did between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, so she felt nobody could have seen her when she opened the door. The UFO was balanced on several feet, and on the road surface was about 12 feet wide and 8 feet high. The upper part consisted of a hemispherical cupola, which seemed to be made of crystal. On top of this, a bluish-white light revolved erratically, the light dimming whenever it slowed down. The cupola was supported by a disc surrounded with a ring of colored lights that changed constantly from white to purple and then to yellow. The occupant of the craft was about 5 feet 10 inches tall and dressed in a dark, tight-fitting garment and a helmet. Around his ankles and wrists there were glowing white bracelets, and in the middle of his belt was a square buckle of similar iridescent material. The senorita was not sure about the color of his skin and could not see any hair. She said that the man seemed to be interested in the alfalfa and walked toward it with unusually long strides. According to the witness, physical vestiges of the craft were left at the landing site, for when she went to the window of her room she saw a soft glow where the object had been standing. Intrigued by this, she inspected the ground. On the surface of the road there were black footprints, similar to those made by ordinary shoes, the heel mark narrower than that of the sole. Marks must have been seen by everybody coming to the house, but the senorita told no one of her experience at the time, and therefore did not draw attention to them. While they remained, however, the area where the UFO had landed continued to glow at night. The investigators considered that the senorita's illiteracy added to the authenticity of her account on the grounds that she could hardly have fabricated a story of such complexity. After speaking with members of her family, they realized that their knowledge of other UFO encounters was insufficient for her to have picked up such detailed data from them. Furthermore, there seemed to be no motivation for a hoax, for it was only by chance that she mentioned her experience to her brother-in-law 18 months after the event. Other members of the family later told the investigators that after their first interview with the senorita, she had wept hysterically and rounded on her brother-in-law for having given away her secret. This report comes from the late great Rosemary Ellen Guiley's book, Monsters of West Virginia. There was a strange creature spotted one night in February 1994 in Braxton County, where the famous Flatwoods Monster case took place in 1952. Was it a weird bird-animal combination or a mystery humanoid? Only one sighting was reported. 3 men were out driving on an isolated road. They rounded a curve and came upon a tall, winged figure standing in the middle of the road. It had long, spindly, turkey-like legs, and it stared at the men with glowing eyes. After a few moments, it turned, rose up an embankment, and vanished into the night. Later, one of the witnesses said he thought the creature's head looked like that of a pterodactyl. What about mermaids? On September 8, 1809, the Times published the following letter from one William Monroe. About 12 years ago, so like 1797, when I was parochial schoolmaster at Ray, Scotland, in the course of my walking on the shore at Sandside Bay, being a fine, warm day in the summer, I was induced to extend my walk towards Sandside Head, when my attention was arrested by the appearance of a figure resembling an unclothed human female, sitting on a rock and extending into the sea, and apparently in the action of combing her hair, which flowed around her shoulders, and of a light brown color. The resemblance which this figure bore to its prototype in all its visible parts was so striking that had not the rock on which it was sitting had been dangerous for bathing, I would have constrained to have regarded it as really a human form, and to the eye, unaccustomed to the situation, it most undoubtedly appeared as such. The head was covered with hair, of the color above mentioned, and shaded on the crown. The forehead round, the face plump, the cheeks ruddy, the eyes blue, the mouth and lips of natural form, resembling those of a man. The teeth I could not discover, as the mouth was shut. The breasts and abdomen, the arms and fingers, the size of a full-grown body of the human species. The fingers, from the action in which the hands were employed, did not appear to be webbed, but to this I am not positive. It remained on the rock 3 or 4 minutes after I observed it, and was exercised during that period in combing its hair, which was long and thick, and which appeared proud, and then dropped into the sea. Whatever it was that William Monroe saw and described in such detail, he was not alone, for he adds that several people whose veracity I never heard disputed had claimed to have seen the mermaid. But until he had seen it himself, he was not disposed to credit their testimony. But as they say, seeing is believing. The story was sent in from Ted from New Jersey. Since I was a kid, I've had all sorts of paranormal and creature experiences for a long time. I am a heavy believer in the supernatural and in dogman and cryptids. Here are 2 of my encounters with what I think are dogmen. It was a clear, sunny day as I was walking alongside a trail that was close to my house. I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time. It was so beautiful out that day, and as a kid, I was taking it all in. I was having an adventure, picturing myself just running through the open fields, waiting for my mom and dad to get home. The trail I was on had beautiful scenery all around, with tall grass and miles of fields to my left and dense forest to my right. I was just walking through the woods, as whenever my parents weren't home, that's what I used to do. I was just enjoying the walk, taking in all the feels of nature. The smell of the woods was intoxicating, as well as the chirping birds. Then the woods fell silent. I felt like someone or something was watching me, and my eyes darted around the entire area. I looked to my left and I noticed something in the tall grass. To me it looked like a big dog, but then I saw it was crouched down like a man would be if he were hiding. It was covered in brown fur, looked like it had a muzzle and ears like a German shepherd, and had eyes that were blood red. I thought it was more curious than frightening to me, but I was still on edge. I was scared for a bit, but I acted like I didn't notice it. I just went along my day and ran back to my house. I never spoke about this encounter with any of my family, as they would think I'm crazy, but that was my first encounter with what I think was a dogman. The second encounter happened about 8 to 10 years ago. At this point, I lived in a different house. This house was close to a large forest, and the biggest predators I've seen around have either been coyotes or foxes. Now, what I saw that night was no coyote. I woke up in the middle of the night with my throat dry, and I realized I was thirsty. I went to the kitchen to get some water when I felt a sudden sense of dread. I felt like I was being watched. I looked into the window close to where I was, and to my horror, I saw this huge animal in my backyard. Whatever it was noticed me, and it was staring at me with those crimson red eyes. I felt utterly terrified, and to my horror, I saw the animal bare its teeth at me and stand up on 2 legs. This creature then started growling, and I could hear it as my window was opened slightly. I also saw its breath come out of its mouth, and I realized that this was a real animal. It looked to be about 7 to 8 feet tall on both legs, with the head of a German shepherd, and a body shaped like a bodybuilder. Whatever it was, then looked at my fence in my yard, ran to it, jumped across it, and into the woods below. I went back to my bed, terrified, and couldn't. These 2 encounters with these beings have shook me to the core, and made me realize that there are creatures that science refuses to recognize. Yeah, thanks, Ted. You hear that a lot with dogman encounters. They have red eyes just like a Bigfoot, and they usually have a head like a German shepherd. Weird. My brother and I encountered a strange creature near our grandparents' cabin. When I was 12 years old, my 15-year-old brother and I experienced a very horrific event while at our grandparents' cabin. My grandparents own a cabin on a rather large island in southern Sweden. which contains only 2 cabins separated by slightly less than a mile. One summer, my brother and I, along with my mother and my sister, went to visit them for a weekend. The thing we did most during our days there was go fishing, mostly angling. On the first day of our stay, we were planning to fish. We set everything up, and all we had to do now was to dig for worms, which we used for bait. Grabbing a shovel along with a bucket, we went to the back of the cabin and down a short slope and through a trail, where we usually find plenty of worms. The forest is very dense and barely no light shines through, which makes the whole setting a bit unnerving for me, as I have always been easily frightened. I hear something walking, and I look at my brother with a very scared face. He brushes it off as if there was nothing to be afraid of, and insists that we go check it out. We walk a bit further down the trail, which I know leads to an open meadow, as I've been there looking for mushrooms with my mom at previous occasions. Before we get to the open, my brother holds up his hands as if to indicate for me to stop. I look over his shoulder and see behind the trees what appears to be a moose looking directly at us. I got relieved, as I knew they were friendly, and as I had seen plenty of moose nearby. My brother, however, who has never been scared of anything, looks back at me with the biggest eyes I've ever seen, and the most pale I have ever seen someone, as he tells me that we should get out of here. Without questioning him, I start to walk back. He keeps pushing me as if to make me move quicker, and as we reach the cabin, we are pretty much running. My mother and grandma are sitting on the porch as we get to the front door, and I tell them that we saw a moose. My brother, on the other hand, remains completely silent. Safe to say, there was no fishing that day. The following day, we didn't even bring up fishing. I'm sitting on the porch reading a magazine, and my brother is sitting inside on the couch doing the same, although he still has that scared look in his eyes. I spent the following hour or two reading several magazines until my grandpa asked me where the shovel is. I realize that we left it where we were looking for worms the previous day, and I tell him where it is. Just as he is about to go get it, my mother tells me that my brother and I have to go get it, since we left it there. She also tells me that we should dig up some worms, as she wants us to go fishing later in the day. I don't question it. I have this very strong feeling that he stayed back because he was scared something would happen. I started hearing the bushes around me sway, and hear sneaky footsteps moving closer and closer. Everything is all the more creepy, as I have no idea where the footsteps are coming from. One second I'm sure they're coming from my right, and the next it feels like they're coming from the completely opposite direction. I quickly put the few worms I found in the bucket and fumbled to pick up the shovel, as I feel I'm being watched. My brother walks up to me and helps me steal the bucket, and I tell him it feels like someone is watching, to which he responds that we should leave. Just as we turn around and are ready to head back, I hear a crack behind me, and I turn around. I look down the trail, and I see the moose once again, peeking at me from behind a tree. It looked very different from what they usually look like, and it felt much more slim and sort of twisted. At the time, I am more confused and curious than I am scared, and my brother is dead silent. I can't quite see the whole body of it, but I know something is wrong. I stand for a couple more seconds watching it, as it is staring right at us. From what I can see, I realize that it is not standing on 4 legs. It is leaned forward, as an old man with a really bad posture, with his arms hanging straight down. I also had this weird sensation that the creature was trying to talk to me, saying, "Let me help you." In a few seconds, I get struck with panic, and I start walking really fast back to the cabin, my brother doing the same. It only takes a second before we are both in full sprint running back, and I don't look back until we have reached the cabin. I turn around, and the moose-like creature is nowhere to be seen. We put the shovel by the shed where we took it, and bring the bucket with worms to the front where my mom and my grandparents are sunbathing. The day goes on as if nothing happened, and we don't speak of it at all. Since this happened, I have never brought it up again with my brother. We both just sort of knew that it would feel wrong to speak about it, and none of us have visited my grandparents at that cabin since. To this day, I'm not sure at all what I saw. I mentioned it to my friend once, and he told me that if what I said was true, then it was probably a Wendigo. He showed me some pictures from Google, and I instantly found resemblances of the creature that I saw back then. Until recently, I completely repressed the event. But after reading several stories about Wendigo, my mind has once again been haunted by this event, and in a terrible way, as I realized that what I saw most likely was something far more horrific than a moose. Out of all the things I have read about Wendigo, the most terrifying thing is the people saying never to talk to it. I'm just imagining in my head what could have happened if I had tried talking back to the creature when I felt it speaking to me. Update. The guy that wrote the story about that Wendigo contacted his grandma, who he had fell out of touch with, and he told her about what he and his brother had saw. His grandma said, "About 30 years ago, I was staying at the cabin by myself. Your grandpa was working at the time, so I was alone for the whole week. One night while I was sleeping, I woke up with an uneasy feeling. I wasn't sure why, but I just knew something was wrong. I felt as if I was being watched. My first thought was to fall back asleep, so I did. I woke up in what I believe was about an hour, and this time I was sure something wasn't as it should be. I felt the same feeling of being watched, and I could clearly hear something moving outside. I grabbed my bedside candle and lit it as I got out of bed. I chose not to pull the curtains, as I have this terrifying feeling that something will be staring right at me. By now I'm convinced that someone is trying to rob me. I was sleeping in a room at the back of the cabin, and so I walk up to the front, look out by the porch, but I see nothing. There are no neighbors nearby, and I can't call the police as I have no phone. I decide to go back to bed and try to sleep the fear away, and so I do. I lay there for at least an hour without falling asleep, and although the sound is gone, the unpleasant feeling has stuck around. At the backside of the cabin, right outside my window, was an older cabin, which we used before this one was built. The place was creepy, and we eventually decided to burn it down some years later. Anyway, I hear something bumping around outside of it, and I realize that I'm going to have to look out the window. I get out of bed, light the candle again, and go to pull the curtains. The uneasy feeling is still there, and I have the strongest feeling that something is going to stare right back at me. I pull the curtains, and for a second, I am caught in complete horror. I see something staring back at me, but it's no robber. It's not a person. It's a moose. I expected to be relieved to find that it was nothing but a harmless animal, but that was far from what it was. After some seconds I calmed down, and the panic faded a bit. The thing was still staring at me, but it was, for sure, not a normal moose. I took some seconds to investigate it, for at first it was not standing on four legs. It was bent forward, as if the upper/front legs were just barely floating above the ground. It was also much more slim than a moose, and had this sort of disturbing twist in the body. The antlers just looked flat out terrifying. Naturally, it doesn't say anything, but I had this strong feeling that it wanted me to come out. It wanted me to let it help me. Although I felt that's what it wanted me to hear, I just knew the thing had bad intentions. I faint within a few seconds, and I wake up in the morning and let out a scream of panic. The creature is gone, and I'm contemplating whether or not I was dreaming. To this day I was unsure if this had actually happened, or if I was dreaming. Now that I know you saw the same thing, I know it was real. There you go. What do you think? Are all these guys just making this stuff up? Or did they really see these things? And what are they? I think they're aliens. Gotta be aliens. But we are woefully out of time, and we will see you again right here next week. Thanks as always, Jimmy Haunted, and thank you for listening. God bless you.
Oh, Johnny, I apologize. I forgot you were there. You may go now.